Despite some of the news over the Easter weekend, I hope you all had a wonderful Easter with your church and family. We had some great Easter services at my church, and we spent some time with family and friends over the weekend celebrating the resurrection of our Lord. But a lot has happened over the last week, which we'll talk about this week and next. On today's show, we'll talk about a political strategy from the 60s unfolding before our eyes. RFK was asked if Biden or Trump was a bigger threat to democracy. We've got news from the college basketball world, and a Christian organization is being scrutinized for ministering to public school children. Let's talk about it. I'm Blake Watson, and this is We the Free. One of the best ways that you can help our show today, other than by sharing the content, is by picking up some We the Free merch at wethefreeshow.com. You can be the salt and light you were meant to be by wearing the Salt and Light shirt or by sipping your coffee from the Salt and Light mug, or you can sport the God Bless America shirt and, of course, the classic We the Free crest tee. We've even got stickers and a Smells Like Freedom candle. That's right. So check out our new merch at wethefreeshow.com. Richard Cloward and Frances Fox Piven were not only collaborative professors in political science and sociology, they were husband and wife. Professor Piven is still living at the age of 91, but her husband, Richard Cloward, passed away in 2001. At this point, in 2024, what is probably their most effective work together is hardly known or discussed. It's playing out before our eyes, though, in many forums and in many political arenas, and understanding their ideas at this point is paramount to the preservation of freedom. In 1966, Cloward and Piven published an essay called The Weight of the Poor, a Strategy to End Poverty. This was their primary focus and passion, especially for Frances. She was an activist, a socialist, and a Marxist who sought to utilize whatever means necessary to create the most equitable, classless utopia, just as Karl Marx had always dreamed. So it's important I preface all of this by saying that their strategy was meant to eliminate poverty. But it's this very framework and strategy being applied elsewhere today. So this is what they wrote in 1966 about eliminating poverty. It is our purpose to advance a strategy which affords the basis for a convergence of civil rights organizations, militant anti-poverty groups, and the poor. If this strategy were implemented, a political crisis would result that could lead to legislation for a guaranteed annual income and thus an end to poverty. Let's just take this first statement in reverse. They suggested using the government and the legislative branch to eradicate poverty. In other words, a system of the government to address poverty, which is basically the welfare system, but not quite. They said this would be achieved by a political crisis, and that the crisis would somehow be caused by a convergence or a combining of forces of three groups: the poor, militant groups or violent, destructive groups, and civil rights organizations, which at that time was only referring to black civil rights groups. And you have to remember that this was just 2 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed. In summary, their opening argument here was instigating poor, black, violent people and others associated to create crisis so awful that the government would have no choice but to act. Okay? Now, the strategy evolves a bit. They wrote, "The force for that challenge and the strategy we propose is a massive drive to recruit the poor onto the welfare rolls." It's important to remember the key component of crisis in Cloward and Piven's strategy, okay? Crisis. Here, they're suggesting as a treatment of poverty to get as many people on the welfare system as possible, that this would create the political and social crisis necessary for revolution, an intentional flooding of the system, if you will. But the strategy doesn't merely employ a contrived crisis, it capitalizes on genuine crises, like an economic crisis, for example. They wrote, the legislative reforms of the Depression years, for example, were impelled not so much by organized interests, exercised through regular electoral processes, as by widespread economic crisis. The Great Depression was an economic collapse, which created a mass economic crisis in the U.S., also known as poverty. So what happened? The New Deal happened. Government programs were created. The federal government was massively expanded. It launched the welfare state, which is why Cloward and Piven are citing it in their explanation. The problem for revolutionists is, though, in America, we have a constitutional democratic republic. The opportunity for socio-political revolution is slim to none outside of crisis, without the full support and help of one of the major political parties, if not both. Not to worry, though, because Cloward and Piven had this all figured out in the 1960s. They said, in the face of such a crisis, urban political leaders may well be paralyzed by a party apparatus. The national Democratic leadership, however, is alert to the importance of the urban Negro vote. Indeed, many of the legislative reforms of the Great Society can be understood as efforts, however feeble, to reinforce the allegiance of growing ghetto constituencies to the National Democratic Administration. So the revised version of the Democratic Party after the realignments of 1932 emerged as a vessel for revolutionary change in America. FDR empowered the federal government through the New Deal, and following in his footsteps, Lyndon B. Johnson did the same with the Great Society in the 1960s. More government. Government is the solution to all problems. Expand, bloat, throw money in government expansion at the problems. And who would become the political pawns of this movement but the blacks in America? Now hang on to that. A couple years later, in '68, Cloward and Piven wrote, poor people win mainly when they mobilize in disruptive protests. By disruptive protests, we mean acts such as incendiarism, riots, sit-ins, and other forms of civil disobedience. Great surges in demands for relief benefits. Here you have a more detailed list of the violent, forceful mob mentality that Cloward and Piven encouraged for the sake of political revolution and change. Disruptive protests, incendiarism, which is fires, bombings, etc., riots, and these are coupled with non-violent disruptive protests like sit-ins, civil disobedience, surges in demand, etc. For what reason? What would doing these things accomplish? Well, they said, mass disruption, both its emergence and its successes, is closely related to electoral politics. When a regime is insecure, it is more likely to bargain actively for support. Social movements thrive on conflict. Okay, so stop right there just a second. Barack Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, in 2008, infamously said, never let a crisis go to waste. Now, where do you think he learned that? Cloward and Piven said, social movements thrive on conflict. Movements have the impact they do on electoral politics, mainly because the issues they raise and the strife they generate widen cleavages among voter groups. So you have a crisis or a conflict, and revolutionaries, or you could call them Marxists, exploit the conflict to cause a defection in electoral politics. They called this dissensus politics, as opposed to consensus politics. Revolutionary change is not accomplished through a unified system, but a divided one. So we're going to talk about today's examples, but let's just think back to 4 years ago. Mark Levin wrote this: This strategy has also largely played out in America's streets and politics as Antifa, BLM, and other Marxist anarchist groups exploited both the initial economic collapse due to the coronavirus and the death of George Floyd. Now, just retrace the steps we're taking here. The death of George Floyd was a racial crisis. The coronavirus pandemic was a health crisis. Both of these things caused economic crisis. So once again, you have these revolutionary mobs carrying out riotous, incendiary acts, exploiting dissensus politics, co-opting the Democrat Party to enact a revolution in the United States. Which major party was fully supportive of these groups? Which party was it that never once condemned their destructive rampage? On that note, the design of the American government is a massive hindrance to revolution. Even the minority power retains some form of power, and there are 3 branches of the federal government, and the states have individual power. Crises don't happen often enough or regularly enough to accomplish the extent of revolutionary change the Marxists are after. So what can we do to address that? Well, keep in mind this idea of dissensus politics and this age-old idea that we stand united but we fall divided. Cloward Piven wrote, "Social movements, even movements that are not particularly disruptive, can do what party leaders and contenders for office in a 2-party system will not do. They can raise deeply divisive issues. In fact, social movements thrive on drama and urgency and solidarity that result from raising divisive issues." So, what are the social movements of our day? What are the divisive issues of our time? In 2024, have you noticed the exponential rate at which divisive issues have risen in the present age? Racial movements continue. Sexual movements have exploded. Climate movements have erupted. You're witnessing a blatant attempt at a revolution. But for what reason? A Marxist utopia where everyone owns nothing and everybody has an equal slice of the American pie? No, of course not. Evil men throughout the last 2 centuries have enacted the plans of Marxist communism to oppress populations and enrich themselves. Every single time, Marxism creates dystopia, the opposite of expectation, and this is directly attributable to the inherent evil of man. Just ask the Chinese, ask the Cubans, ask the Cambodians, ask the Romanians, ask the Ukrainians. Marx's bloody footprints are all throughout the last 200 years. You ask, well, Blake, who is it that wants to radically transform America? Well, just 5 days before Election Day in 2008, Barack Obama said, quote, "We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America." And indeed, he was correct. Federal spending skyrocketed. Obama legislated from the Oval Office like a dictator. From his office, outside of the legislative branch, he issued his dictates on amnesty, gay marriage, guns, private business, etc. His scandals were all subterranean. Nobody talks about them, and hidden from the public thanks to our stellar media and press. Benghazi, the weaponizing of the IRS and the NSA, though he could speak in eloquent words and form coherent sentences, unlike his vice president and the current president, Obama was the first in modern history to demonize political opponents and attack them on many fronts. Remember, the key is dissensus, not consensus. Racial tensions hit a decades-long high with Obama in office, a fever pitch of racial animosity stoked by a commander-in-chief. All of this to say, we clearly have leadership in America who seek a new revolution in America, a new American revolution. President Biden is effectively a third Obama term, though he's surprisingly more radical than his old boss. Consider the social movements he's championed. Consider his recent State of the Union address. But what about outside of America? There are undoubtedly foreign billionaires and enemy regimes that seek to revolutionize America to its own destruction. And for what other purpose than globalism? Consider America in April of 2024. Our government is massively overspending at such a colossal rate that it's economically unsustainable. It will lead to economic crisis that will, without question, rival the economic wasteland of the 1930s and the Great Depression. The US dollar will lose its value rapidly over a shorter period of time, at which point it loses its place as the world's reserve currency. So the dollar is done, and this massive global economic crisis sets the stage for monetary revolution. A new currency, probably a digital one, which can easily be controlled and manipulated. I think this largely explains what's happening with Russia right now. It explains in part what's happening with China right now. But that's a conversation for a different day. We have a faith crisis in America where Christianity is no longer the religion of the land. We have a new religion, and it's liberalism. That's the revolution there. This should have been abundantly clear to you all on Easter, when Easter had to share the American calendar with the Transgender Day of Visibility, which we'll talk about more next week. We have an immigration crisis on our southern and even our northern borders. This administration refuses to enforce border and customs laws, rules, and regulations. Millions have entered either illegally or under the guise of asylum and are being flown and bussed around the United States. These are not Americans, but our sitting president says they are. And what social political opportunity is this creating? It's changing our electorate. It's changing the governmental composition. It's creating anarchy. It's endangering lives. It's creating more economic instability. It could be an economic time bomb. It could very well be the implantation of militaristic invaders, and it may surely be used to consolidate political power. A whole host of crises there. In a more abstract way, it's weakening the American identity, because all this runs parallel to the assaults on patriotism. And all of this, just a manufactured crisis for the purpose of fundamental transformation and revolution on a global scale. And what about this climactic crescendo of the sexual revolution? This crisis of gender and sexuality and personal identity, which is almost uniquely American. It's destroying men and women, boys and girls, and most importantly, the family, which is the bedrock of civilization. In similar fashion to how Democrats treated blacks in the 60s and made lofty promises of change and revolution, there is no plan to fix anything, because the plan today is to destroy everything. Now, if I'm correct in my analysis of all this history and academic literature and the current social, economic, religious, political, global situation, the revolutionaries would, of course, not want you to know any of this, which is why I think Wikipedia just recently removed the opening paragraphs of an article defining the Cloward Piven strategy. Here's what the site used to read. The Cloward Piven strategy is a political strategy outlined in 1966 by American sociologists and political activists Richard Cloward and Frances Fox Piven. It is the strategy of forcing political change leading to societal collapse through orchestrated crises. The Cloward Piven strategy seeks to hasten the fall of capitalism by overloading the government bureaucracy with a flood of impossible demands, amassing massive unpayable national debt, and other methods such as unfettered immigration, thus pushing society into crisis and economic collapse by overwhelming the United States. Now that second paragraph is misleading, and you should know that by now after all that I've just explained to you, but what the paragraph suggests is correct. No, Cloward and Piven never wrote anything on destroying capitalism, but their philosophical forefather, Karl Marx, certainly did. Cloward and Piven never wrote anything about national debt or immigration, but you do see the framework for their strategy from 1966 playing out before you to push the American society into crisis and economic collapse, an overwhelming of the United States. Just remember the prophetic writings of George Orwell from 1984. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. James Lindsay is an author and academic here in America and from East Tennessee. Here's how he explained it on Joe Rogan's podcast.
The Cloward Piven strategy, I'm sure you've heard of that. Somebody's got to have talked to you about the Cloward Piven.
Can you explain it?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. The idea is that you take advantage of a system in the way that it's set up so that you overwhelm it. In particular, in this case, you're going to overwhelm social services. You're going to overwhelm, border enforcement. You're going to overwhelm whatever they're doing in the cities. It's like tens of thousands of dollars per taxpayer or whatever per year going to dealing with what they're calling the migrant crisis. So you try to overwhelm the system in order to basically collapse it so that you can create a crisis, and the crisis creates the excuse to bring in new policies. Oh, well, maybe what we need is, what do they call it, E-Verify or something? So we need a digital system where we can track who everybody is, but then they get their digital system and then you're off to the races. This is an old strategy, well documented.
In 1968, the Beatles released a song titled Revolution, in which John Lennon sang, "You say you want a revolution." Well, we all want to change the world, but when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out? If there's any revolution that's going to happen, it's removing these Marxists, revolutionists, and globalists from our leadership in our American institutions of government and education and religion. The real revolution is coming to the tyrants who want to watch the world burn while they stuff their pockets and laugh at our demise. If it's not that, you can count us out. Now let's get to the news feed. Robert Kennedy Jr. was on CNN this week and was asked whether Trump or Biden was a greater threat to democracy. And you know that I hate this phrase, threat to democracy. America is not just a democratic system. We are a constitutional democratic republic. We are governed by our founding document. Everyone is subservient to that legislation. The people of the United States elect people to represent them in our federal government. That's a republic by a democratic process. Now, the liberals wish that we were a pure, outright democracy because they could revolutionize America at breakneck speed, if so. I think that's why they constantly repeat the phrase over and over, threat to democracy, this and that. Anyway, we'll play along for the segment. RFK is basically asked, who's worse, Biden or Trump? Here's what he said.
People talk about the threat to democracy that Trump poses. Do you really think that is an equal evil to Biden?
Listen, I can make the argument that President Biden is a much worse threat to democracy. And the reason for that is President Biden is the first candidate in history, the first president in history that has used the federal agencies to censor political speech, so to censor his opponent. I can say that because I just won a case in the Federal Court of Appeals and now before the Supreme Court. It shows that he started censoring not just me. 37 hours after he took the oath of office, he was censoring me. No president in the country has ever done that. The greatest threat to democracy is not somebody who questions election returns, but a president of the United States who used the power of his office to force the social media companies, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, to open a portal and give the access to that portal to the FBI, to the CIA, to the IRS, to CISA, to NIH, to censor his political critics. President Biden, for the first president in history, to use his power over the Secret Service to deny Secret Service protection to one of his political opponents for political reasons. He's weaponizing the federal agencies. Those are really critical threats to democracy.
Donald Trump, of course, tried to overturn a free and fair election. He tried to overturn one, right? He's still fighting in court.
Yes.
How is that not a threat to democracy?
Well, I think that is a threat to democracy. If trying to overthrow the election clearly is a threat to democracy. But the question was, who is a worse threat to democracy? And what I would say is, I'm not going to answer that question, but I can argue that President Biden is, because the First Amendment, Aaron, is the most important. Adams and Hamilton and Madison said, we put the guarantee of freedom of expression in the First Amendment because all of our other constitutional rights depend on it. If you have a government that can silence its opponent, it has license for any atrocity.
So just to be clear, you're saying you could make an argument that President Biden is a worse threat to democracy than Donald Trump. That's what you just said.
But who else has ever tried to censor? What president in history has ever tried to censor political opponents?
They try to cut him off, saying, but Trump, and he agrees with her, but says that Biden's violations of the First Amendment and his weaponizing of federal agencies demonstrate a much bigger threat to quote-unquote democracy. And you could add to this the Democrats' attempt to remove Trump from the election process through a bogus interpretation of the 14th Amendment, the rainstorm of political prosecutions he's facing in multiple courts at multiple levels to hamper his campaign and drain his money, and also the disparate treatment from Biden's DOJ. Really, the question that should be asked is, who is the biggest threat to the U.S. Constitution? And that is undoubtedly Joseph Robinette Biden. Now, questioning or contesting the results of an election are not threats to democracy, and they never will be. That's why the Democrats are contesting the election results in 2016. That they're still contesting that. That's why they objected to and fought the results of the 2000 election. Speaking of Donald Trump, there have been all sorts of reactions to this commercial of Donald Trump selling Bibles. Let's take a look at the ad and then we'll talk about it.
This Bible is the King James Version and also includes our Founding Father documents. Yes, the Constitution, which I'm fighting for every single day, very hard, to keep Americans protected. Also, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and the Pledge of Allegiance are all part of this. God bless the USA Bible, and it's just very important and very important to me. In the end, we do not answer to bureaucrats in Washington. We answer to God in heaven. Christians are under siege. We must protect content that is pro-God. We have to bring Christianity back into our lives and back into what will be again a great nation. Our founding fathers did a tremendous thing when they built America on Judeo-Christian values. Now that foundation is under attack, perhaps as never before. I'm proud to endorse and encourage you to get this Bible. We must make America pray again. Pray, get educated, get motivated, and stand with me and the legions of Americans asking God to bless our great nation, to bring our great nation back, and to make America great again.
The God Bless the USA Bible. No, this has nothing to do with Trump's campaign for president. I doubt he's making any or much money off of this, but surely he's benefiting from this partnership, at least electorally. But This Bible has been out for years, actually, being promoted by Lee Greenwood, who wrote and sang the song, God Bless the USA. I've seen this Bible. It's the King James Version, and it's large print, so it's likely for older generations, and it's mostly like a collector's item, that it's, because it's being hawked by Trump and Lee Greenwood. So for that reason, if you account for shipping, the Bible costs $75. I used to sell Bibles. This Bible is definitely not worth that much money. It should be $20 to $25 because it's bound in synthetic leather, fake leather. There's no commentary with it. There are no tables or references. It's just the scripture until you get to the very end of the Bible, just after the pages of Revelation. And then there's some of the things Trump alluded to, which makes it the God Bless the USA Bible. After the book of Revelation, you have a page with the lyrics to God Bless the USA, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Pledge of Allegiance. So, what do I think about this? Although these founding United States documents were heavily inspired by the biblical doctrines of liberty, I don't think these things ought to be bound within the covers of the Holy Scriptures. The Pledge of Allegiance was written in 1892, but under God, the line under God was not added until 1954. And I'm sure that Lee Greenwood is probably a good guy and all, but we're talking about the writings of men being bound together with the writings of God. So I don't think it's okay for these two things to go together as if they belong in the same book. Now, you know me, you know that I'm proud to be an American, and you know that I firmly believe in the divine authorship and authority of Scripture. I love our Declaration, our Constitution, etc., but I'm not a huge fan of this Bible. However, I think the reaction to this has been ridiculous. The liberals have been accusing Trump of using this to get votes, and I'm sorry, but anybody that's buying this Bible they're already voting for Trump, okay? I think the attention should be on the juxtaposition of Trump endorsing a patriotic Bible and saying, let's make America pray again, and promoting a resurgence of Christianity and Christian values, versus the sitting president who's promoting transgenderism on Easter Sunday. As you know, March Madness is going on for the men's and women's college basketball. I'm a little bit sore from Tennessee's loss to Purdue and the referees they were playing on Saturday. So the Final Four has been set for this weekend for men's basketball, and tomorrow is also the Final Four for women's college basketball as North Carolina State takes on South Carolina and Connecticut takes on Iowa. Now on Monday this week, Iowa played Louisiana State in the Elite Eight. Iowa, of course, won the game to advance, but several people online have pointed out that LSU's team skipped the singing of the national anthem. Take a look at that moment. So you can see Iowa's whole team on the court. They're standing in respect to the anthem, the flag, and those who fought to defend them. And as the camera turns, you don't see LSU at all. Their bench is totally empty. Now, apparently, they were on the court, of course, probably warming up, but then left and went to the locker room before all of this. Well, they would go on to lose the game, and their coach was asked about this in the post-game interview. Watch.
Wasn't on the floor during the national anthem. First part, was that a conscious decision on your part? Second, can you say what the team was doing during that time?
Honestly, I don't even know when the anthem was played. We kind of have a routine where we are on the floor, and then they come off at the 12-minute mark. That's when we just, I don't know, and we come in and we do our pregame stuff. I'm sorry, that's nothing intentionally done.
According to Kim Mulkey and several others who have commented on this moment, LSU is never on the court for the national anthem. They're instead back in the locker room doing pregame stuff. Why? Why would you not be on the court for the national anthem? Is it because you would just rather avoid the contentious situation of players taking a knee? Listen, I don't buy that she just had no idea when the anthem was being sung. I think that this coach should be fired, and I think that because she coaches at a school which receives a bunch of tax dollars and federal funding, this is a team in the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association. And which nation does this association represent? That's right, the United States. Now, the governor of Louisiana, Jeff Landry, is threatening to revoke the scholarships of college athletes who are absent from the national anthem. The Guardian has the story on this. Louisiana's Republican governor has called for the scholarships of college athletes who are not present for the national anthem before games to be revoked. His announcement came after the LSU women's basketball team were absent during the pregame ceremonies on Monday night ahead of their eagerly anticipated NCAA tournament contest with Iowa. The governor said, "My mother coached women's high school basketball during the height of desegregation. No one has a greater respect for the sport and for Coach Mulkey. However, above respect for that game is a deeper respect for those that serve to protect us and unite us under one flag. It is time that all college boards, including Regent, put a policy in place that student athletes be present for the national anthem or risk their athletic scholarship. This is a matter of respect that all collegiate coaches should instill." The point here is, you have been granted the opportunity and funded the opportunity to do what you love to do because you're in America. So your first priority should be showing some respect, and LSU needs to change their routine. Now, I can hear some of the skeptics and some liberals or libertarians in the comments saying that they should be free to boycott the national anthem. And if that's what you believe, then you probably believe people should be able to burn flags and hang other nations' flags in our public classrooms, or BLM or pride flags in their classrooms. You're probably fine with singing the black national anthem before football games as well. But not me, because I believe we must be one nation under God. I believe the founders' understanding of liberty, which flowed from the Judeo-Christian idea of liberty, is that it's not a license to do whatever you want. It is the freedom or liberty to do what is right or virtuous to do. Things like this are divisive and disrespectful, which is to say they're wrong and should not be tolerated. At some point in August of last year, I did a lengthy segment explaining the political doctrine of separation between church and state. It's a vastly misunderstood and misused doctrine in the political and cultural spheres. It's not in the Constitution. It was written by Jefferson for the state of Virginia, which basically concerned the state of Virginia not supporting the Church of England. But the taxpayers didn't want to support the Catholic Church there. So it was about the state of Virginia not establishing a church or religion. The First Amendment bars the United States Congress from meddling with religions or creating laws on behalf of religions. And other than that, there are some court cases which have cited Jefferson's writings from the Virginia Assembly and then also the Bill of Rights. But so many have taken this doctrine to mean that we can't create any legislation which aligns with Christian beliefs, or a judge cannot rule from a Judeo-Christian mentality or worldview, and public schools can't talk about religion or church. You can't have prayer in schools. You can't teach the Bible in schools, etc., etc. Well, we'll talk about this more next week, that it's impossible to separate any society from religion. But here's a story that's cropped up in the last couple of weeks. There's a Christian organization called LifeWise Academy who is on a mission to reach school children with the gospel. NBC News did a full piece on this organization, and you can guess why they did it. Let's watch the first part of the video and then we'll talk about it.
As classmates head to the library, this group of Whitehall School District students in Ohio put on matching shirts, board a bus, and head half a mile down the road to church. There, elementary students like Emmanuel and Savannah Brady pray and study scripture.
He approached the Philistine.
This is LifeWise Academy, a nonprofit bringing the Bible back into the public school day.
The learning really helps you learn about Jesus and what happened in the past.
How popular would you say it is at school?
Mainly, like, the whole class is, like, over at LifeWise.
LifeWise started in 2018 with 2 schools. Today, it partners with more than 300 schools in a dozen states. It's funded by private donations, and it's legal, so long as it's optional, off-campus, and not during essential classes like math. Though to some, it represents an increasingly blurry line between the separation of church and state. Doug Shoemaker, a Whitehall administrator, says the district has allowed this kind of program for decades.
We neither discourage participation or reward or encourage it.
Dad Daryl Brady says LifeWise lessons positively motivate Emmanuel and Savannah.
Do you think church has a place in school?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to bring churches back into schools for a long time.
Some of these sessions take place when library periods would be happening in school. Mm-hmm. Are you worried about your kids missing out on that experience?
Not at all. I mean, there's 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament.
Founder Joel Penton says he saw a growing need, including those unable to afford private Christian schools.
In this area, about 50% of the students take part in LifeWise. What do you think that means for the other 50%? Do you think they feel left out?
I wouldn't characterize it that way. Kids go in different directions all the time. On the playground, some kids play kickball, other kids will go to the monkey bars.
This is a little different because these kids are going to physically be gone.
Sure. I mean, hopefully LifeWise is an attractive thing that people will want to participate in, but we certainly don't ever want to put any undue pressure.
NBC News reports, LifeWise Academy is permitted under a pair of little-known, decades-old U.S. Supreme Court rulings that allow for off-campus religious instruction during school hours. When LifeWise launched in 2018, the initial goal was to serve 25 schools by 2025, but it surpassed that long ago. By the start of this year, LifeWise had set up chapters in more than 300 schools in a dozen states, teaching 35,000 public school students weekly Bible lessons that are usually scheduled to coincide with lunch or non-core classes such as library, art, or gym classes. Penton, who's the founder, said most people are surprised when they learn that this type of program, known as release time religious education, is legal. Supreme Court rulings in 1948 and 1952 established that public school students could receive religious instruction during the school day, so long as the classes took place off school property and the government did not promote or pay for it. Now, of course, not everyone is a fan of this happening. Watch this.
What do you think LifeWise is trying to do?
Influence, slant, if you will, public schools.
Joel says he pays little attention to critics.
In the United States, there are 13,000 public school districts. There are 50 million public school students.
And he hopes to make biblical lessons available to every one of them.
So Joel Penton wasn't pleased with how the story was published, so he published his own video to demonstrate what NBC News left out.
Well, NBC News did a national news piece on our organization. I have to say I'm a little disappointed because we invited them in, we lined up people for them to speak to, and they left out some of the most critical information. They left out the results. In this news piece, they didn't share what results we're seeing. We get questions every day from schools, from parents, from community members. What are the outcomes? Are you seeing results? And the numbers are in. There are real results. We commissioned a third-party independent study with Thomas P. Miller and Associates. They studied thousands of schools and found that when LifeWise is implemented in a school, attendance goes up. Schools are struggling with attendance post-COVID-19, and with LifeWise, attendance goes up to the point that there's a net increase in class time. Even though kids are being removed for a short period of time for Bible education, they end up spending more time in class simply because attendance goes up so much. Also, in-school suspensions go down, out-of-school suspensions go down, so there's clearly improved behavior. If you're reporting on this, why wouldn't you share these results after we shared them repeatedly? Here's some other numbers we shared repeatedly, and that's that Americans want programs like this. A nationwide scientific poll recently done by RMG Research found that more than 3/4 of Americans believe public school students need moral and character education, and more than half of Americans believe the Bible should be used for that moral and character education. We shared that repeatedly. Again, those numbers were not included.
Attendance is up. A net increase in class time, suspension is down, which means improved behavior. All of this is no surprise to us as Christians, because this is the effect that the God of the Bible has on people, even children. When I was growing up in middle and high school, there were school release programs where kids could, by their parents' permission, leave school, get on a bus, and go to a local church where an evangelist was speaking. Now, I wanted to go because I was a Christian and I wanted to be with my Christian friends at these events. But other kids would go who were not Christians because they wanted to be out of school, which was really the whole point of the evangelism. But then these things just completely stopped happening, and I'm guessing that's because enough liberal parents complained about separation of church and state, and now it's gone. I do believe there are still Bible classes in my county as an elective course with some kind of history credit, but I would love to see something like LifeWise make its way into East Tennessee. But I want to know what you think about all of this in the comments. Well, that's going to do it for me. What'll it be next time? We'll see. For now, go and be the salt and light you were meant to be, and we'll see you next time on We the Free. Thanks for watching this clip. Listen, I want to make sure that you stay informed on the news and the biblical response to it. So do yourself and us a favor and hit the subscribe button before you go. And then we would love for you to go check out WeTheFreeShow.com to grab yourself some merch to spread the word of We the Free. And we're also going to put a video on the screen right now that we think that you'll like. Now, go and be that salt and light, and we'll see you next time.